Good morning, first grade, and welcome back to Bible. Today's story is entitled David Adopts Mephibosheth's Family. And today we'll be talking about the love and mercy demonstrated to family and friends in the story of David and Mephibosheth is an example for us to follow. And our memory verse today comes from Proverbs chapter 18, verse 24. Some friends may ruin you, but a real friend will be more loyal than a brother. David was hiding from Saul in the desert. One day, as he sat in his tent, one of his men stood at the door and spoke to him, "My lord, my lord." David looked up with a start. "Someone to see you, my lord." David looked past the scout's head and squinted at the bright sunlight at the door of the tent. "David, is that you?" "Jonathan!" David leapt to his feet and threw his arms around his friend. His words tumbled over each other in his excitement. "Where did you come from? What are you doing here? How did you find me? Oh, it's so good to see you." Jonathan laughed and didn't even try to answer all the questions at once. The two friends sat down outside the tent to talk. "God must have sent you, my brother," David said. "I have been so discouraged, so sad. It's been so long. How I miss living in the same household with you. I miss you too, David, but you know it was unsafe. It was bad enough when my father threw his spear at you while you sang to him. But when he began seriously plotting to kill you and even trying to get me to help him, it was time for you to go into hiding." David said he was afraid that people would try to make him king instead of you. He wants you to be king after him. "My father knows he's lost the kingdom through his own disobedience," Jonathan said. "I would far rather have you be king, and I would be second to you. God has chosen you to be king. I don't want to make the same mistakes my father made and go against God's will." The two friends talked for a long time. Jonathan reminded David of God's promises and encouraged him. When Jonathan had to leave, David felt stronger in his faith and in his future. "How blessed I am to have such a friend," he thought. David continued to hide in the wilderness for years. Then came a fateful day. The Philistines were fighting the Israelites, and the Israelites were losing. As they were running away, the Philistines caught them, killed Saul's 3 sons, and wounded Saul so badly that he killed himself. It was 3 days before David learned the awful news that Saul and Jonathan were both dead. David wept. He had lost his best friend. His freedom from Saul's threats were unimportant, for Jonathan was also dead. He wrote a song for Jonathan, but too late for Jonathan to hear. He missed his friend the rest of his life. God was only David's comfort. David went to Hebron, where he was officially anointed king. There were still problems in the kingdom, and it was many years before there was peace and unity in the land. David had some great victories and made some serious mistakes. He always praised God for the victories and asked his forgiveness for his mistakes. Finally, David was king over all of Israel. His decisions were fair and right for all of his people. Not everybody was delighted with the new king. There were some who believed that David had stolen the throne from Saul's sons or grandsons. On the day that the news arrived at the palace that Saul and his 3 sons were dead in battle, the household was in a panic. Everybody ran, thinking that whoever took over the throne would kill them. There was a little boy in the palace that day. He was Jonathan's little son, and his name was Mephibosheth. His nurse came running into the room, screaming, "We must run for our lives!" She snatched up Mephibosheth and ran out the door and down the hall. Mephibosheth squirmed and wiggled. He didn't need to be carried like a baby. He was beginning to feel scared. Suddenly, in the wiggling, the nurse dropped him. Mephibosheth screamed with pain. His nurse picked him up and took him to the place of safety and cared for him as best as she could. But both of his feet had been broken and never healed properly. Mephibosheth never walked again. That was bad enough, but the damage in his heart was worse. He was told that his father was dead and that it was David's fault. As he grew up, he was taught that David was the enemy. Mephibosheth thought he should have inherited the throne, and he should have been the king. It was all David's fault. He was sure that if David found him, he would kill him. Mephibosheth became very frightened one day when a messenger came to David that he was looking for anyone left of Saul's family. He certainly couldn't run for his life. Maybe it was just as well to have his useless life over with. He was taken to the king. Face to face with the enemy, Mephibosheth trembled and bowed down before him on the floor. "Mephibosheth," King David said, coming toward him. "I am your servant," said Mephibosheth. David said to him, "Don't be afraid. I will be kind to you for your father Jonathan's sake. I will give you back all the land your grandfather had given to Saul, and you will always be able to eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed to David again. Mephibosheth said, "You are being very kind to me, your servant." David turned to the man who had told him about Mephibosheth and said that he and his family were to be Mephibosheth's servants. He was also to take care of all of Saul's property for him. But Mephibosheth will stay here in the palace. Mephibosheth had been wrong. In the coming years, he learned just how wrong he had been. He learned that David had a kind and generous heart. They talked for hours about Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan. And so another friendship grew, and Mephibosheth learned something else too. David didn't think he was a worthless person just because he couldn't walk. David was strong and he was a mighty man, just the sort of man Mephibosheth had always wished to be. Yet David loved Mephibosheth and taught him that God loved him too. They stuck it out together because that's what families are for. So today's memory verse comes from Proverbs chapter 18, verse 24. Some friends may ruin you, but a real friend will be more loyal than a brother.